Hi there, and welcome to this week's Career Insights. I'm Sarah Burgess, and this week I am joined by two of our coaches, Katherine, Lambert and Michaela, Henshaw, and we're going to be talking about the first 90 days in a new role. So there's been quite a lot of interest in this topic. So as always, if you could let us know when you're joining from, where you're joining from, and if you've got any questions, please do feel free to ask those throughout so that we can be as interactive as possible. So we're going to kind of crack straight on with the first question, which is the 90-day plan. So what is it and why is it important to have one? So Katherine, I'm going to start with you. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. So I've seen a study recently where it says we go through an average of 1.5 transitions every year at least. And with COVID, that may well be for some people even more. And so really thinking about how we get up to speed in a new role and how we feel about, well, that will really help us to think about how we feel about the role and really create a good first impression. And initial impressions are often formed really early when it comes to starting a new role. And so therefore there is a piece around you never get a second chance to make that first impression. So having either a plan or a framework for those first 90 days in that new role can really help us to set us up to succeed in it initially and move on from there.
Brilliant, thank you. And Michaela, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so for me, the 90-day plan is what it says on the tin. It is a plan for the first 90 days. And as Katherine said, that might be a framework. It could be, a broad plan. It could be a very detailed plan. It doesn't really matter, whatever works for you. Why is it important? I think it's important whether you are, so we've had some feedback that said it's only for leaders. And it really isn't. So yes, there might be more broader things to think about as a leader, but whether you're a leader or whether you have no team, it doesn't matter. A plan is super important because it's about how it helps you to hit the ground running. How do you really build that momentum quickly? How do you really start to build your credibility in that new role? And therefore, how do you really build your self-confidence, particularly if you've just been made redundant, or if you've had a bit of time in between roles, so you're getting back into the place of work again, or if it's a brand new job, you've never had a job before, then building your self-confidence in that new role and showing that it doesn't matter whether you were there 30 years before, or not. You're not a one-trick pony. You can do this in any organisation, and so for me, that self-confidence is super important.
Brilliant. And we were talking earlier, weren't we, about the fact that we're kind of just sort of coming out of this COVID period and people are returning to work. So actually, you may well have been out of work for much longer than you might have been previously. So this is just a really good kind of grounding piece, really, just to get you back in that frame of mind. Okay, so in terms of planning your plan, when do you need to think about this? So we've got a kind of couple of examples here. So interview, you might get asked for this in final stage interviews before you start your new role. So Katherine, do you want to lead on this one?
Yes, absolutely. And thinking about it as you go into maybe the final stages of an interview can be really helpful. Firstly, because we have clients who get asked, how would you approach this when you first join? So it helps you look really prepared and that you've thought about some of this and how you would hit the ground running. And actually, even if you don't get asked about it, it could be a really great thing to bring up as something that you've thought further into, actually, I'm imagining what it's like when I'm in the role. So that is a really good point to be thinking about it. And then also, obviously, if you are successful in that role, a few weeks before you go into it, if not before, to really just think about, right, now that I know the role and the organisation, how am I going to finesse that plan to really make sure it helps me in the specific role I'm going into? So I think there's two key stages to think about with this.
Okay, great. Michaela, anything to add to that?
Yeah, so definitely agree with everything that Katherine said there. And I think, I get lots of questions around, well, what questions do I ask in an interview? What are the really good questions to ask to set me apart? And I think, to sort of, add to Katherine's point, even if you don't get asked the question, being able to say, I've been thinking about, what a first 90-day plan would look like, and and asking a question relating to that, I think it just shows you're very prepared, you're very thoughtful, you kind of really want that job and you really want to land successfully. So as an ex-HR director, I would that would really impress me, and it would I'd bet there'd be a big tick on that CV as I was interviewing. The other thing for me is that you don't start doing your 90-day plan. So this, so Katherine's talked about when you prepare that, but the doing of the 90-day plan doesn't start on day one of the job. There are lots of things that you can do in the run up to that. So thinking about what you can there'll be lots of information you need to gather, so there'll be lots that you can do via the internet, talking to colleagues that maybe work there, talking to colleagues that maybe have worked there previously, and talking to the organization and asking them what you can do ahead of time to get you prepared. So when I went to work for, I worked for a retailer. When I went to move to that retailer, I agreed with them that I would go and visit some stores and meet some of the store directors ahead of time. So that, I hit the ground running with that. I'd started to build those relationships, understand some of the issues. So you can never start too early, in my view.
That's great.
Sorry, I was going to say the other thing I'd add to that, Michaela, I know when we were talking earlier, is in terms of when you might think about it, it's not just as you go into a new role. So it might be that you're transitioning to a different function or a different area. And again, that can also be a really useful time to start to think about building a plan or a framework. Absolutely, yeah.
Absolutely.
Anything that differentiates you, isn't it? That's the thing.
Absolutely. I mean, we're not, so again, I swapped disciplines when I was working, when I was employed, and when I did that, I was a finance director on a Friday and an HR director on the Monday, and they were quite an unforgiving employer. They expected me to be as good on the Monday as I was on the Friday, but what did I know? So to have a plan in my mind of already, what was I going to do? How did I work with my team? How did I get up to speed with, the kind of technical aspects that I didn't know as well? Who were my key stakeholders? All of those kind of things, it even though I'd been in the organisation for a number of years, still very important.
Absolutely. And I've just thought of an example here this is actually my mum. So she retired from a pharmaceutical industry role and wanted a part-time role. So she applied as a library assistant, so definitely not a manager, in a part-time role where she was going to be covering a number of different branches. And before the interview, she went and visited all of the branches and then was able to talk to the interviewer about the differences between the branches and what might work in one. And the interviewer was really surprised. And basically that's why she got the job, because nobody else had thought to go and do that. And you think that seems like a fairly obvious thing to do if you're going to be covering a number of branches to look at them, but obviously not, because no one else had thought of it. And that kind of thing could tailor into that 90-day plan as well, couldn't it?
Definitely.
Brilliant. Okay, so moving on then. So how do you come up with this plan? And again, I've put a couple of points here, so different chunks, what to include. So Katherine, again, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, so I think it does help to really break it down into 3 key sections. So that 30 days, 60 days and into the 90 days as well. So in that initial bit, I would say it's around making a start. So those first 30 days, it'll be around meeting people, gaining more information about the business, thinking about the role and the expectations of the role, just getting to understand the culture of the business. How do they communicate with each other? How do you connect in? What's the sort of way we do it around here, essentially? Then in the next sort of 30 to 60 days, I'd say it's more about trying to make sense of all of the information that you've started to learn about and building momentum. So that might be around really thinking about how you can build key relationships, start to connect how different parts of the business fit together. And so sort of starting to deepen that knowledge. And then as you go into the sort of 60 to 90 days, that last third, it's more around sort of getting clear, making informed decisions. It might be identifying where there might be some quick wins, where might there be areas of opportunity, and really starting to think about those wider relationships as well. So I definitely chunk it up into 3 sections.
Excellent. Okay, and Michaela, I know you've got some other things to add to that.
Yeah, so Katherine's talked about the sort of 3 phases, the 3 timings, and within that I've sort of got 4 headings that I tend to think about. So the first one is what I would call new beginnings. So this is about, you've got to let your old job go. So if if you're harboring a grudge, or if you're upset about how it happened, or you're just anything like that, you've got to kind of let that go, and this is a new beginning, a new start. How do you get yourself in that real positive frame of mind? It's also, irrespective of what happened in your previous role, even if you came out there in a really good space, it's about remembering you're not there anymore, and this is a new place. So kind of, what do you want to be, how do you want to be known? How do you want to be seen? What do you want, though? Katherine talked about first impressions. What do you want those first impressions to be? And being really clear about that. And one of the things to be very careful of there is this piece around not keep referring to your old employer, because that becomes very annoying very quickly. Now, you will have been employed for your experience and expertise, so absolutely you want to use that, but you've got to think about, it's not the what, it's the how you portray that. So so don't keep saying when I was at blah, because that becomes quite annoying, and I hear that all the time. So the other piece around the new beginnings for me is balance. So, so work-life balance is something everybody talks about, and everybody struggles to get that right. This is your chance to set out your stall and say, this is me, this is how I work. And, to do that from day one, because if you do that from day one and you stick to it, people just get used to that's how you work, and nobody questions it at all. So it's your chance to be able to do that. So that's new beginnings. The next piece for me is investigate and analyse. So, Katherine was alluding to that in the second and third phases. So very much around, what information do you need to know? A lot of this, as we said, you can do beforehand as well. But, being really open with your questions. This is, any question you can ask it when you're new. No question is a silly question. So having those open-ended questions, not coming in with any judgment. So even if you think something's done really badly, you need to understand why that might be, and there might be things you don't know. So being really sort of open and just asking lots of questions, and then doing the analysis around, well, what does that therefore mean? So that's the second bit. The third bit is around setting yourself up for success. So, what does your line manager expect of you? So you need to be really clear about what good looks like for them in the first 30, 60, 90 days, because you don't want any surprises where they go, oh, I was hoping you would have done this. Why haven't you done it? So having those clear expectations, and also your expectations for them, then they know what you expect of them. They know what you know what they expect of you. So that's super helpful. And then also thinking about those very quick wins. What are the really simple, and people sort of think these are big things that they've got to deliver. You're not going to do that in the first 90 days. It can be very small things, but things that just make a difference either to others or to you and how you land in that role. And then the fourth thing for me is fourth heading is relationships. So, be it a team, be it your stakeholders, or be it your sort of, peers, collaborators, then you need to kind of map out all of that. So if you have a team, then you need to be, meeting with those guys regularly. You need to be asking lots of questions, really actively listening. What do they do? How do they do it? What works? What are they frustrated about? What are their career aspirations? All those kind of things. And then because if you're starting to analyze and investigate, then what you need to be able to do ultimately is, of course, derive a vision, a strategy, a plan. And you're going to need to know, is your team structure, and are the people in the team and the skills they've got the right ones to help you move forward? With stakeholders, of course, then, who are they? building those relationships with them, understanding what's important to them, who might be an ally, who might be quite difficult, why might that be, all of those sorts of questions. And then the same with collaborators, so your peers, particularly if you're in a team, then your peers are all around you. If you're not in a team because you're a leader, or you're a leader of a team, so therefore your peers might be in other teams, then that becomes even more important, because you need to be able to build those relationships, work out who those allies are, who's going to help you as a sounding board, who can you trust to sort of have that peer sort of confidant. So that those kind of 4 headings I think are super important to think about.
That's brilliant, and I will add those to the chat afterwards so that people can kind of reflect back on that. So that's really, really useful stuff. Thank you, both of you. You can see Alison's added a comment here, say such a great tip, even Michaela, on balancing. So a great way to reinvent yourself in a new way of working in a new company. Absolutely. And I know I've got a fairly senior client who was basically burnt out in her last role. So she took the time when she was off to really reflect on what the new role was going to mean for her. And as you say, she went in with very clear expectations of herself, actually, of what she was going to do in the mornings before she started work, and how to structure her day and not become the person that everyone depends on constantly. And I think it's working really well for her. So it's great opportunity, isn't it, to be strong like that?
Absolutely. And I did it when I think I just said before, when I moved from being an FD to an HRD, and my children were just starting school, and so I needed to kind of reinvent how that worked for me. So it was the perfect opportunity, even though it was same employer, new role, reinvented myself. And it amazed me actually how quickly people just accepted that was how I worked.
Yeah. Brilliant. Good. So I'll just add that we have got quite a lot of people watching. So if there are any other questions or comments, please do feel free to add them. But in the meantime, our next question, I think we've kind of covered this, which was things to think about. So we'll move on to the next one, which was how do you track your progress with your plan? So Katherine, do you want to start again with that?
Yeah, so I think it's important to think about how often you want to track progress, but making sure you do that throughout those 90 days is going to be key, and on from there as well. So initially you might want to do that more often, so maybe weekly, and then you might want to move to monthly. But this is one of those things that it needs to fit with your own working style and approach. Ideally, if you can have some time in with your manager to really do that review together, I think that is really powerful and helpful, because it helps you to really get clear on expectations and how you're meeting those. And if you need to course correct a little bit, you can do. But even if you aren't able to do that with your manager, I would say reflecting what it was that you wanted to do in that week or that month, and how close you've come to it. What are the 3 key things you've done well? What are the 3 key things that you'd want to do differently? And therefore, what will you do going forward? I think can be a really nice, simple model that can help you review and track that progress. But doing it frequently, especially in those early days, weeks, months, is really key for me.
Yeah, great. And Michaela, anything to add to that?
So for me, it's the plan is your plan, and you need to own it. Too often I get people saying, well, the company didn't have everything ready for me on day one, and I didn't get, there wasn't really an induction, and all of those kind of things. And of course, that isn't great from an employer's perspective, and that tells you something. But that doesn't stop you taking control of what you can control. So really owning that plan. And as Katherine said, the review against it, and being quite frequent around that, and saying, what's working, what isn't working, what do I need to do differently, who can I check in with, is really important. Because otherwise those 90 days are going to just fly by, and you'll get to the end of the 90 days and think, well, what have I done? So having that ability to be able to check in and celebrate success around the things that have gone really well, build your confidence. The things that haven't, okay, that's fine, but I'm course correcting. I'm going to think about what I can do differently, so that but that by the end of the 90 days you're going to be in a really good space. So to me, that frequency of checking in with yourself and really taking control and owning it is very important.
Absolutely. I remember back when I was employed a long time ago now, but when I started a new role, I did something similar in that at the end of every Friday, I would write 3 things that had gone well that week relating to my plan of what I'd wanted to do, 3 things that hadn't worked out, because obviously things change, don't they, during the week, and you might not be able to do what you wanted. And then 3 things I was going to focus on the following week. And I found that was a really good way to kind of end the week and then start again the next week. So that was great. Okay, I can see a couple of questions coming through. So Alison's come up here with, how do you get your plan in line with the company expectations if the company don't set you any objectives? So Michaela, do you want to go with that one?
So I think if the company don't set objectives, then I think that's something you've got to drive for, because, you know, you really need objectives, because they're going to measure you at some point. So what are they measuring you against? So I would be quite tough around making sure that you do get those objectives. And again, own it. So if your line manager isn't saying this is what I expect, you write down what you think that, you know, they should be, and send them to your line manager, and then, you know, talk to your line manager about them and say, you know, this is what I think I should be doing, you know, how do you agree, yes or no? So really owning it and driving it, and you should get to a place where, you know, you're aligned in. If it might be a state of flux, and that might be one of the drivers of it. But again, even if it's a state of flux, there will be things that you know, very short-term objectives that you can agree, even if the longer term is a little bit more uncertain. So I would get as much as you can agreed up front.
Brilliant, thank you. Anything to add to that, Katherine?
No, I agree with everything Michaela said. I guess what it's also making me think about is the fact that that probably is linked to your manager's style and way of working. So some people are very clear on this and will give you what their expectations are from day 1 through to day 90 and on. And other managers will be a little bit more relaxed about how that happens. So I still think Michaela's point around owning that yourself and taking to them what you think that therefore should be is important. But it's also about you starting to work with your manager, and you'll get used to their style. They need to get used to your style, and sort of meet in the middle, where the sort of the really great relationships and trust starts to build. So still exactly what Michaela's saying, but it starts to tell you a little bit, I think, about the relationship you have with whoever is setting those objectives too.
That's a really great point, actually. That reminds me of this job that I was just referring to. My manager said to me, my objective was to create a learning culture, and that was it. And I went home to my husband and I was saying, this is brilliant. And he was totally freaked out by, what on earth does that mean? What are you going to do? And I'm like, well, I don't know, but it's brilliant. So I think that's the thing, isn't it? You really need to build that relationship with your manager and understand what's going to work. Because clearly, if my manager had said that for my husband, it wouldn't have worked at all. But for me, it was perfect, because I wasn't going to be micromanaged. I could just crack on. And it was that kind of trust, I guess. Great. Okay, I've got another question here from Irina. So she's saying, do you suggest sharing this plan after a HR screening or after an interview with a hiring manager? So that's a good question in terms of when to actually present it. So Katherine, have you got any immediate views on that one?
I think there could be merit in doing that. I would say there's a bit of judging the organisation and the interactions you've had up till now as to whether that seems like something that they'd be really keen to see more. So I don't think it's harmful, but I guess there's the piece of, how's it gone? How are you feeling? You know, I guess at that point you think you've got through to a second round, because if you're sharing your 90-day plan and actually you haven't heard whether or not you're in the shortlist, I guess that might be a bit trickier. Maybe not the sort of hitting the mark with where they are in terms of whether they think you'll be a great fit. So I think you need to judge it a little bit in terms of how how those screenings so far have gone. But I think on the whole, if you're getting a sense that they are interested and keen and want to keep progressing, then there's no reason why you shouldn't. What do you think, Michaela?
No, I totally agree, Katherine. I think with a 90-day plan, you know, you can have quite a detailed framework that's quite generic. The detail comes with, who are the stakeholders, but knowing that you've got to kind of, meet your stakeholders and meet your team and things, you can have all of that. So irrespective of where you're interviewing, you've got roughly a good idea of what that looks like. So it doesn't really matter, I think, where you are in the state, in the process, because obviously the further down the process you are, the more detailed you can become, because the more information you're learning. But it might be appropriate. It might not. I think you're right in that you've got to judge. If you feel it's going to make a difference and it's going to make you stand out, then, as I've said, build it into one of your questions. Build something to do with your 90-day plan into one of your questions. You can't kind of shoehorn it into a question they've asked if it doesn't work, but you can turn it the other way and say, right, I'm going to ask a question about it. So it's very much a judgment on, what's being asked and at what stage and what I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you could start with, I've been thinking about a 90-day plan, and then kind of go into what your question is to do that. So yeah, that's great. So Alex's question kind of leads on from that, really. So if you're talking about the 90-day plan at the interview stage, what do you suggest speaking about if you do not fully know the company objectives? So Michaela, any additional views on that one?
So I think the company objectives, you could get a fairly big sense of what they are from the website. So most of them will have some sort of vision, mission, purpose, some values, all of those kind of things. So you can start in, you'll have had, that there'll have been some sort of job deck or a spec or something like that, that you will have seen. So you can get a good sense of what that potentially could be, even though, it won't be refined or honed. So, and again, if the more vague it is, the more questions you've got to ask, really, because sort of clarity around how many stakeholders have I got, what am I, what am I doing? I'm kind of learning about the culture of the organization, so asking those questions around, my favorite questions are always around culture and values. So you can read it on a piece of paper or on a website, but asking your interviewer, what do you really love about working here? What's the one thing that you get frustrated about that you'd really want to change? Why would that be? Kind of that gives you a really good sense of the culture, which then helps you to start formulating parts of your 90-day plan. So I think it's very much, again, using your judgment, depending on where you are and what but there's lots and lots of questions that you can derive from it.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to go on to our next question now, because we're kind of starting to run short of time. So mistakes to avoid. So we weren't too sure about this question. It sounded a little bit negative, but I think it sums up what we want to say, really. So Katherine, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things to remember is to be yourself. So as you start to create that plan, assuming you're moving into a new role, whether it's with a new business, a company or not, it's about making sure you're being authentic and you, because it is exhausting trying to be someone that you're not really. And at some point that's going to come out, because it just will. So I think it's about, when you think about your plan or your framework, doing it in a way that's authentic to you is really, really important. And rather than being the person you think they may want you to be, because actually they've hired you or chosen you for that role because of who you are and the strengths you bring. So yes, you want to set out your stall in terms of your boundaries and your balance and work-life balance and all of those things, but you still need to be your authentic self. And that would be one of the key ones, I would say.
Yeah, that's good. And we talked yesterday about assumptions as well. So I shared a story with Katherine and Michaela about a friend of mine who's a CTO, so really senior. He started his new job in the office, and they kind of took him into his office and just left him there. And then he said, nobody showed me where the toilet was or where the canteen was. So even really basic things like, can I have a tour of the building? That's a really good thing to have in your 90-day plan, because sometimes if you get more senior, people forget about that kind of basic stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Michaela, anything to add on the mistakes?
Well, I think assumptions is a good word. So, and it's on both sides, isn't it? So, you know, for me, I think I mentioned it earlier, it's about going in without any assumptions and with no judgments, being really kind of open and really actively listening, because what you first see might not be the reality. So the more you can dig and the more you can learn, the more you'll start to really get to grips with, with the reality and what that is. So not making those assumptions. And the other mistake that I often hear as well is, just kind of remembering that this is a new organization for you. If you've moved into a new organization, it will be different to where you've worked before. Even if the job is exactly the same, how they do things, the way they do it will be different. And just kind of being open to that, and not judging on, that feels better or that feels worse. It's just different.
Yeah.
And that's how it is. And yes, over time, there might be things you want to change, but, kind of just accepting that difference.
Brilliant. Just had another question here. So from Jenny. So what she's saying is, do you have any specific advice on starting a new job whilst working from home? So Katherine, anything to mention there?
And I'm sure as we're coming to the end of time, we can think about this and type some in as well. But I think it makes those relationships even more important. So finding those people who can help and support you, because you're not going to be just wandering around and getting it by osmosis. So I think being very purposeful about the interactions you have can be really helpful there.
Brilliant. And the next comment is very, very similar. So the person saying, how do you adapt your plan if the new role relies on a lot of face-to-face interactions with stakeholders due to COVID? So your state is in lockdown and those interactions are limited to remote/online only. Michaela, anything to add to that?
So I think so totally agree with Katherine. And I think, again, you know, rather than you can't just wander past and, sort of have a chat. So you are going to have to be more planful in who you need to speak to and how often you need to speak to those people, and don't be afraid if you've booked in an hour and actually you realise, you need 2 hours, to say, can I book in another session with you? Because this has been really helpful, but it is about just making sure you've got all the key people booked in as quickly as you can. And that's, there is no substitute for having those, face-to-face via video conversations, unfortunately.
Brilliant, thank you. So Ian's just added a comment there to say thank you for your comments on not referring too often to previous organisations. Can I also suggest this is true if you move to a new country? It can be annoying to hear how well things are done elsewhere. So yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Ian. Okay, so I'm just going to head to our top tip to leave with now. So we are just a little bit over time now. So Katherine, do you want to give us your top tip?
Yes, I think it's just back to the point I made around mistakes to avoid, around just be yourself, be your authentic self in terms of how you approach your plan. Some people like to write everything down to the greatest of detail. Others like to just have thought about it and have it more as a sort of loose framework. And then how you go into that role and your 90 days is all around just doing it in a way that's authentic to you. Okay,
and Michaela, your top tip?
So my top tip is own it. So own your new start. Think of the point I made earlier about think about, how you want others to see you, what that you want them to know. What are those first impressions? And really own your plan. As we've said, don't wait for others to do it for you. Really own it. Do that regular review. And own that regular review so that you can refine it and really get out of it so you get the best start.
Brilliant, thank you. So one final question's come through, which I think is really worth putting up. So I'll just quickly add that. So it's saying, in regards to a role where you're the external candidate going up against an internal candidate who will understand the processes better, what would you recommend to help stand out? So have you got any very quick comments on that one? So Katherine?
I think that's a bit of an assumption that's being made there, actually, because yes, they will have an internal working knowledge, but diversity of thought is really important, and actually bringing in external perspectives can be really, really powerful. And so I think if you can talk to that in some way, in terms of the fact that because you've got different experiences and skills, that can really help move things even further with the business. I think that's something that I would probably go to in terms of thinking about what I bring from that perspective.
Brilliant, thank you. Michaela, anything to add to that?
Totally agree with Katherine. I think, it is about that diversity, and if I think describing what you would do to get to understand those processes and how you would look, and thinking about your experiences and how there might be best practice that you can bring to the party and share, but also recognizing there could be best practice in the new organization as well, and there's learning for you. Then I think if you're looking at it from both angles, I think that's the best way to go.
Brilliant, thank you. So Marcello's just asked if we've been recorded, and yes, so it will be available on the 1080 page, so either on LinkedIn or on YouTube. So I will again answer this comment later. I just wanted to end with a quote which Michaela sent yesterday. So Michaela, do you want to read it out as it was your quote?
This is one of my favourite quotes. I have it on a board in my office. So some people want it to happen, some wish it would happen, and others make it happen. So this is why a 90-day plan is so important, and you owning it, because by doing that, you will make it happen in the way you want it to.
Brilliant. Okay, so thanks everyone for joining. Thank you for all of your comments and observations. Thank you to Katherine and Michaela. Next week, I'm going to be talking to 3 people actually next week. So Jill and Alison, who have been on before, and Linda Litherland, who's a new coach with us. And we're going to be talking about summer job hunt strategy. So looking forward to that one. Okay, we just had a couple of thank you messages from Jenny. Someone else, I think that was actually Tess, but it's come up anonymous, and an awesome quote there from Mandy. So thank you everyone for joining, and as always I will go through and respond to all the comments later on. So thanks again, have a great day, and there you go, there's another comment there. So I'm going to end the broadcast now, so thank you very much and see you next week.